when we are dealing with what's happening in Israel, I'm sure you can relate to what I'm going to say. The one of the first things that happens is you start going back to where you're listening for the word of God, and where's the easiest way to find the word of God is in the Bible. So I always look to say, is there something that we can draw from? Is there some other story, some kind of message? And it came to me, and we had just discussed this, earlier in the book of Samuel, when we discussed the whole issue of Saul being commanded by God to destroy Amalek. Okay. And we had part of our discussion was also about what seems a very troubling commandment, not just to destroy Amalek, to defeat them, but to destroy them completely, including the women and the children. And we discussed this a bit and talked about different things. We talked about wars in biblical times and different standards and all that kind of stuff. But all of a sudden it came to me. So first of all, Amalek, we know this, and I think we did discuss this, but this is fundamental in Jewish thought. Amalek represents the ultimate evil. And you can see that when Amalek first in Exodus, right after the Exodus from Egypt, when Amalek first attacks the nation. Here you have, and it's right after the Song of Moses, or very shortly after. So you have this amazing miracle that has happened, and then this everybody else seems to be kind of deterred. You have the Song of Moses, and Moses talks about the Canaanites are just quaking, and they can't believe that what they have just seen or heard about. But then there's good old Amalek that says, well, what do I care? I'm going to take up this battle, and it's not just a battle against the nation, it's a battle against God. And then in Deuteronomy, we have the commandment to remember what Amalek did. Okay, and this is in Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. Remember what Amalek did to you as you were leaving Egypt. And what does it say? As you were on your journey, you were tired. Okay, you were weak. What does Amalek do? He goes and finds the weakest amongst you. Okay, so already you have a sense with Amalek that they're taking advantage of the situation. They're fighting against God, but they're also looking for the weakest among us, and that's where they're going to attack. Yeah. And this has become really this idea of Amalek, this ultimate evil. But then you look at the details, what creates this ultimate evil? Seeking the weakest, the men, the women, the children, the elderly. These are the weakest. And, we have long seen Hamas and all of these Islamist terrorists as Amalek, as people that are trying to fight against Israel and fight against God. But I suddenly put this all together, and there's all this stuff being talked about in the international media about, yes, Israel has a right to defend herself, but God forbid you should hurt any civilians. Okay, and I think what God is commanding, suddenly I had this understanding. What God, I believe, is commanding Saul. It's not like you have to make sure you wipe out all the women and children, but you have to wipe out Amalek and not worry about the women and children. Because you've got to get to the root of the evil. And the only way to get to the root of the evil, there will be women and children who are killed as well. But you have to wipe out the nation so they have no more existence as a nation, so they can no longer harm you. And suddenly all of this rang so clear to me as we're dealing and facing the very same kind of thing. And I will just remind you something that we're going to get to in our study of Samuel in a further chapter, and that is Saul's death. Saul is already died. He's been injured. He's dying, and he falls on his sword, and he wants help to be killed, to die. Okay. And this young man walks by and he says, help me. Okay. And so he does, and he helps him die. And he's like, it's a merciful thing, even though David is not so keen, but that's a complicated thing that we're going to deal with. But there's no question that, and who is this young man? He's an Amalekite. Okay. But he's an Amalekite who has come out of Amalek. Okay. That's his background, but he's come out of Amalek and he's joined the nation. And I think that what this is telling us is there are options for individuals to step out of the nation that they're born into, to step out of this behavior and do something else. And there's also, I don't know if any of you have seen this. I've only seen it in Hebrew, otherwise I would be putting it around. But if I see it anywhere with English subtitles, I'll definitely send it out. There's this fellow from who was born and raised in Gaza in a Muslim family, and he somehow saw the light and came across to Israel and converted to Judaism. He's a proud Israeli. He's amazing. And he gave this interview to Israeli television where he said, you need to understand what you're dealing with. And he claims, and it's very credible, he says, people are saying, there's maybe, 10% Hamas supporters and everybody else is civilians. He says there's probably 98% Hamas supporters, and not just Hamas supporters of killing Jews. He said that is how they are taught. This is how all the schools, and it doesn't matter if you're Fatah or Hamas or whoever you are. Everybody in the Palestinian, culture who's going to school, they're being taught to hate Jews, to kill Jews, to murder Jews. And so he just turned it all on his head. And I'm thinking, on the one hand, he is describing what Hamas is, but on the other hand, here he is a person who made an individual choice to step away from that. Yeah, Yvonne, what would you like to say?
Revelation TV have been showing him. I think it might be the same person. He was.
Oh, I think you're probably talking about Yosef Haddad. That's somebody else. He is an Israeli Arab who is wonderful and is very pro-Israel. But this guy, who I only heard in Hebrew, I've never seen him before, and he was from Gaza. His whole family is Hamas. Yeah. It's just crazy. But anyway, let's go back into Samuel now, where we left off. Enough introductions and messages, and let's go back to where we were. So we left off of chapter 17, verse 4. We started talking about Goliath, and let's kind of hit this and see where we're at. So first of all, it starts out here. We have a champion of the Philistines. Well, it says Isha, but I don't know if a champion. It's more like a representative. Representative of the Philistines steps forward. His name is Goliath, and he is 6 cubits in his span. We talked about how tall he was. Then there's a whole description about all his armor, and he's like this huge guy. He's a giant, and he's covered head to toes with so many very heavy armor. It weighs him down 600 shekels, just the edge of his spear. Okay, now let's assume that some of this is an exaggerated report, which is very common in the Bible, but it's meant to say heavier than anything you've ever seen, giant than ever, like just a crazy thing. Okay, and what happens then? He starts to mock the nation of Israel. So picture this: we have the camps on 2 sides of the valley. Okay, the Philistines from the west, the Israelites from the east, and this valley in between. And this guy comes out representing the Philistines, and he's just saying, first of all, he's going to mock them. And what we see here, again, rings out so closely to what we are talking about today, psychological warfare. This is what he's doing. And so they didn't have Twitter and Facebook and all those stuff then. They had standing up from the army, and he says, why should you come out and engage in battle? I am the Philistine champion. You are Saul's servants. Choose one of your men. Let him come down against me. Basically, he's saying, we don't have to all engage in battle, and then we're going to all just, we'll have a lot of injury. And at the end of the day, he says, you're going to be defeated. So why don't we just have a one-on-one? So then just one person is killed, but then whoever is killed, that one who's defeated, the whole nation then becomes servants to the Philistines. Now, of course, his assumption is he's going to win. Look at the size of this guy. Look how well armed he is. Forget it. They have no choice, and which is his whole point. He's like showing himself. Okay. And then he says, and this is very, very, let's see. So in verse 11, this is the most important part. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and terror-stricken. They're frozen in place. They're like, oh my God, what do we do? Look at this guy. I mean, like, there is a, we see here, and basically, there's something that you see often in the Bible, is, and he said, and he said, and he said. And normally, if somebody's talking, you have one and he said, and then you have whatever it is he said until the next person talked. And then you have the next guy and he said, okay? But notice what we have here, okay? We have in verse 8, he stopped and called out. Then we have, and he said to them in the same verse. And then we have in verse 10, and the Philistine said, okay? And no response. So there's two different, and he said, and I see here, by the way, in my English, you know how I always have problems with the English. It says in verse 10, my English, and the Philistine ended. It doesn't say he ended. In Hebrew, it just said, and he said. So you have a double, and he said, well, actually triple, because it says he called out, and he said, and no response in the middle. So when you have that kind of thing, that is a style, a literary vehicle, shall we say, to indicate that he's saying something and expecting a response and not getting it. So he's saying, okay, guys, out there, you're a bunch of chickens. And he's waiting for them to say, no, we're not. But they're just so frightened, they don't say anything. Then he says, no, come on, this is what we're going to do, you know. So this really, when you get to verse 11 and it says everybody is frightened and terror-stricken, we already have that sense from this, and he said, and he said, and he said, and no response. They're so terror-stricken, they don't have anything to say. And then what do we have? Verse 12. David, the son of a certain Ephrati, which means he's from Ephrat. Now you may recall back in Genesis when Jacob's wife Rachel dies, okay, where does she die? On the way to Ephrat. And what does the verse say? Which is Bethlehem. So Ephrat is another name for Bethlehem. And actually, Ephrat is also, I think, a wife of somebody in the family of Judah, so that it could be that that's the source of the name. Okay, but whatever it is, we know it's Bethlehem. So a certain Ephrati from Bethlehem in Judah, his name is Jesse. He had 8 sons, and the days of Saul, the man was already old, advanced in years. Now there is 2 different words here in Hebrew. Old is zaken, but zaken doesn't only mean old, because if you said it means old and then you have advanced in years, what have you added? A guy who's old is advanced in years. A guy who's advanced in years is old. But the word zaken is also used to be an elder. And we know this concept from the book of Judges, particularly. There are elders of the tribes, and it continues here in the book of Samuel. Until there was a king, one central king, we have elders. So this is in the times of Saul. He's the first king. There are still elders. Who are elders? Local people who are important to our leaders. So here we're learning that Jesse is one of the elders, okay? During the time of Saul, he is one of the elders. Now, and then we have, and you may ask a question, wait, it's making it sound as if we don't know who David is, and we don't know that he is the son of Jesse. We just met him in the chapter before when Samuel comes to crown David, and he meets Jesse and all the sons. So in some ways, you can say this is coming back to reintroduce us to David, because in between we meet the Philistines. But also, I think it's really telling us something about David that we don't know. We know that he's from Bethlehem. We do not know, and we know that his father is Jesse. We do not know that Jesse is an important man. We don't know that he's a leader. And I think this is, really what's happening, what we're telling him here. And also it says he has 8 sons. And we're going to now learn immediately, starting in verse 13, about some of those sons, what we didn't know before. When Samuel meets the sons, he just is saying, oh, no, not this one, not this one, not this one. But we don't really know that much about them. And here we're going to start meeting these sons. Okay, so in verse 13, the 3 eldest sons of Jesse had left and gone with Saul to the war. So what do we know now? David is not coming from this anonymous family of shepherds that mind their own business in the pastures and in the fields. Okay, in the shepherds' fields. What is he? This is the head of the family, is an important man, and there are 3 older sons that are fighting with Saul. They're among his elite soldiers. Okay, so this is important. The names of his 3 sons who had gone to war were Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. And David was the youngest. The 3 oldest had followed Saul, and David would go back and forth from attending on Saul to shepherd his father's flock at Bethlehem. So this is something that we discussed last week. We weren't quite understanding. When we last left David, we found that he was called to be part of Saul's court. Okay, and then suddenly we see he's at home. This gives us that explanation. He's back and forth. Some of the time he's with Saul, but some of the time he's going back and, part of the family and shepherding the sheep. Okay, so here's David. So what happens? In verse 16, we're going back to the Philistines. He's there 40 days. He's making fun of them, and they're still frozen in place. They haven't done anything. They're just sitting there terrified while this Philistine every day for 40 days gets up and mocks them. Okay, now we're going to go back to Bethlehem. We see this sometimes. The scenes move around because in the end, these 2 scenes are gonna join with each other. What's going on in Bethlehem is very relevant to what's going on in the battlefield in the Elah Valley. Back to Bethlehem, Jesse says, "Here, take some food and go to take it to your brothers." All right. So what this back and forth scene is telling us is that the brothers are at this scene, frozen and petrified, even though they're big warriors. They're frozen and petrified, part of that group that's facing Goliath. Okay, and David now, who's a shepherd, right? So his father sent him, go bring food to your brothers, and he's taking food, all kinds of food. And what else he tells them? He says, where is that word? Yes, in verse 18, okay? He says, and bring some token from them. That's interesting. The word in Hebrew is arubah. Arubah is like a guarantee. And so it's very often described as saying, bring back word that they're okay. Not like a guarantee, but like that they're protected. Bring us a word. His father says to him, and bring back some kind of word that they're okay, that they're protected. Okay. So David does this. He gets his stuff together and he goes out. Now, this reminds me very much. We know what happens at the end of the story. Okay, we know that David's on his way to become king, and before he gets to become king, he's going to be really in a battle with Saul, where he's already been anointed king by Samuel, but no one knows this. All right, Saul is the king, so there's this battle that's going on that we don't. It hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen. And basically, it is this. I mean, he's been anointed. The battle is really the beginning of him becoming king. It's going to lead to becoming king. And what's going on now? A very mundane story. His father, Jesse, is sending him to bring food to his brothers. It reminds me of Saul's father sending him to find the donkeys. Okay? Saul sent him to find the donkeys. What does he find? Samuel, and he becomes crowned king. David is sent to bring the food to his brothers, and what ends up, he becomes a military hero. Okay, and in both situations, you have these very mundane stories of sending somebody to do something so ordinary and so small that creates leadership in some convoluted way. And I think there's an echo here that we should be keeping in our mind. This is someone who's going to be replacing Saul at some point, and so the pattern is so similar. Okay, so this is where he goes, and so it says here, verse 20, early next morning, he left in charge of flock, took the provisions, set out, etc. And then he says he reached the camp, okay, as the army was going out to the battle lines, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up their battle lines opposite each other, but they're not fighting yet. They're just yelling and screaming. Nothing has happened. There has been no battle. Okay, so David leaves his stuff there, and he wants to go towards the front. He wants to see what's going on. And while he's talking to them, the champion, whose name was Goliath, the Philistine of God, stepped forward from the Philistine ranks and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. So here David, for the first time, is showing up and actually hear what's going on. And what happens again? What a contrast here. There is this drew up their battle lines and they're crying shouts of war. But what really happens? And this is probably day 40 or whatever. When the men of Israel saw the man, they fled in terror. So there's certainly, these people are not fighting any battles. And they said among themselves, do you see that man coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The man who kills him will be rewarded by the king with great riches. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and grant exemption to his father's house in Israel. So David is hearing these rumors. He's showing up. He sees the guys, and he says, like, what did you say? What's going to happen? And they tell him, wow, and what has he done? What will be done? Look at how David, though, words this question. What will be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes the disgrace from Israel? He realizes that this is not just this big giant who's going to kill a lot of people, but this represents a disgrace to Israel. Why? Who is that uncircumcised Philistine that he dares defy the ranks of the living God? And it is David who puts this whole battle in perspective and understands that this is not just a battle between a big giant and a scrawny group of people in Israel, but it's a battle about God. Okay? All right. So it sounds so great and whatever. And then we have this little story that you have his brothers. And there's a certain Cinderella story about this as well, because here's the big brothers, they're off fighting, and all of a sudden little scrawny David comes in, and he's, what is he doing here? It's one thing he came to leave the food. He left the food with the thing. He should wait until they come back from the battle, find out how they are, go back and report to his father. What is he doing at the front lines? And he says, and his brother says to him, why did you come down here? With whom did you leave those few sheep? I know your impudence and your impertinence. You came down to watch the fighting. He says, you're this kid, and you just want to get in on the action. So David says, what have I done now? I was only asking. It's just so he wants to know what's going on. And he turned away from him towards someone else. He asked the same question. The troops gave him the same answer as before. Okay. So he said something, though. Why? Because in the next verse, verse 31, the things David said were overheard and were reported to Saul, who had him brought over. So the assumption here is David has already said, I'll do it. I'll do it. Why? Because they bring him to Saul, and David said to Saul, let no man's courage fail him. Your servant will go and fight that Philistine. Of course, says you're this scrawny little thing. You don't have armor. You have no experience. How are you going to do this? And what does he answer? He says, number one, he talks about his experience. We talked about this a bit last week in another context. How is it that the servants of Saul thought he had, reputation as this strong guy? So he talks about he killed he killed the lion and the bear. He had a number of situations where he had to be very bold and very strong and courageous, and he was in the context of tending the sheep. And then he talks about God. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and that uncircumcised Philistine shall end up like one of them, for he has defied the ranks of the living God. The Lord, David went on, who saved me from lion and bear, will also save me from that Philistine. Then go, Saul said to David, and may the Lord be with you. And so this moves the battle onto a whole different plane. It becomes a battle of who will God stand with? Who will God save? And David comes confident, not just in himself, but in the entire nation. God will save us. Okay? And so then Saul gives him the armor. David says, too heavy. I can't work with this. And he ends up taking a few smooth stones, and he's going to go. And of course, we know he's going to down this guy with a slingshot, which is quite amazing. But the most fabulous stuff is the conversation here. Okay? So in verse 43, the Philistine called out to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? And then he says, come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds. In other words, he goes into that mocking. But what happened before when he mocked? And Saul is standing there. Saul's the king of Israel. He's there. You have to give Saul a lot of credit. He's not a king that stays in his palace and sends his army before him. Saul is there leading the troops, and he has no less frightened than all of his people. Okay. And yet, here we have David, and here's where we see David already stepping into a role that will make him a king completely different than Saul. He says, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the ranks of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will kill you and cut off your head, and I will give the carcasses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. All the earth shall know that there is a God in Israel. So it's not just that he's coming with faith that God will protect them, but he sees this as a religious war of the ultimate nature, because the outcome of this war will convince them, that's what he's saying, that there is a God of Israel. That, and I think here it's not just, he says, all the earth shall know. I don't know how much the Philistines are going to learn out of this, but Israel will definitely learn out of this. And many around the world, he says, all the earth, I wish, but, many are going to be impressed with this and realize there is a God of Israel. But then, of course, then he slingshot, that's it, cuts off his head, takes the, and what happens in verse 52, or the end of verse 51, when the Philistines saw their warrior was dead, they ran. Okay? They didn't have to defeat a whole army, they had to defeat one man, because this man was so strong and came in the name of fighting God, and he was defeated by this little David with the slingshot. There was no better message that said, God is with us, you have no chance. So the whole army flees. So now who's afraid? Now who's quaking and who can't fight? The battle has turned, all because of these statements of David and the slingshot. Clearly, nobody has ever won a battle with a slingshot. Okay, this is God, and it's just as obvious as can be. The men of Israel and Judah rose up with the work. I pursued the Philistines, etc. Then that's the end of the war. And David cuts off his head, puts his weapon, okay, and he brings it to Saul. Now I just want to finish up with these last few words. It's a very interesting what happens at the end, okay? When Saul saw, we're on verse 55. When Saul saw David going out to assault the Philistine, he asked his army commander, Avner, whose son is that boy, Avner? And Avner replied, by your life, your majesty, I do not know. Then find out whose son that young fellow is, the king ordered. So when David returned after killing the Philistine, Avner took him and brought him to Saul with the head of the Philistine still in his hand. Saul said to him, whose son are you, my boy? And David answered, the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Now, this is one of the strangest interactions that we've seen. It's one thing when we have a reintroduction of David, okay, at the beginning of this chapter, in verse 12. Even though we met David, Saul's met David, and we explained that, okay, now we're learning more about his family, just. But how is it that Saul, where David has been playing the harp for him now for quite some time in his palace, who's been one of his men at arms or whatever, at court, how is it that he suddenly says, who is this fellow? Okay, so now the question is, does he say, who is this fellow? Or is he just saying, who's his father? Because if he says, who is this fellow, that's extremely strange. Well, how does he not know? This guy's been in his house, okay? So there's actually two different ways of I've seen two different commentaries on this. I think they're both very reasonable. One is saying, yeah, that's what he's saying. Who is this guy? How does it happen? Remember we learned that Saul had these periods of melancholy, of a bad spirit that came upon him. And so here we have a period of this bad spirit coming upon him, and that kind of befuddles his memory. He gets confused, like, who is this guy? And then following that approach, the reason Avner says, I don't know, is to save Saul from embarrassment. Because if he says, oh, it makes Saul like an idiot, So he says, well, I don't know either. And so then he just brings David before him to reintroduce himself, okay? Another approach says, no, the issue was not about David, what his name was, or that he was that same guy who's playing the harp, but who's his family, who's his father, okay? And then this is exactly what he's asked, and David answered, I'm the son of Jesse from Bethlehem. what actually is going on here? And here I think you can see the beginnings, the seeds of the jealousy. Here is Saul, the king of Israel, goes out with his army, quaking in his boots, paralyzed, able to do nothing. Here's little David, who has this amazing boldness, faith in God, creativity, and he goes and he solves the problem. Now, Saul has already been told by God, the kingdom is going to be taken away from you. He doesn't know by who. And he now sees, oh my, who is this guy? This could be a threat. And when he asks what family he's from, it's to see, is this the kind of family that has kingdom possibilities? It has kingly possibilities. And of course, Jesse, when we first met Jesse, which brings home, what we saw about him before in verse 12, the need to introduce him as an important man, as an elder. When he says Jesse, he can say, aha, yeah, no, he's from an important family. That's another nail in the coffin here. This is a problem. He's got enormous talents. He's got enormous faith, and this is a nail in this coffin. And then we have this verse. I'm starting now with chapter 18, because I believe this part of it is really connected. When David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. Saul took him into his service that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan and David made a pact because Jonathan loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the cloak and tunic he was wearing, gave them to David together with the sword, bow, and belt. David went out with the troops, and he was successful in every mission on which Saul sent him, and Saul put him in command of all the soldiers. This pleased all the troops and courtiers as well. This is, in the way of the traditional Masoretic text, the story ends here. It doesn't end at the end of chapter 17, it ends here. And it makes sense, because this is really the conclusion of the story. And what we can see here is two different stories being interwoven, okay? The continuation of chapter 58 should have nothing, verse 58 should have nothing to do with Jonathan, okay? Whose son are you, my boy? And David answered, the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. The next continuation of that is really verse 2. Saul took him into his service that day, would not let him return to his father's house. And then the continuation of that would be verse 5. David went out with the troops, and he was successful in every mission, and this pleased all the troops and Saul's courtiers as well, okay? Interwoven into this is a completely different story. When David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. Okay, skip to verse 3. Jonathan and David made a pact because Jonathan loved him as himself. And verse 4. Jonathan took off the cloak and tunic he was wearing. We have two different stories going on. We have Saul bringing David and saying, you're not going home anymore. Almost as if to say, on the one hand, I need this guy. On the other hand, I want to keep him in my sight because I don't know what kind of threat he's going to be. And what happens at the end? He sends him out. He is very well. But then what happens? David grows in popularity, both with the nation and with Saul's servants in the court. Okay. So David is becoming a threat or a source of jealousy for Saul because of his military successes. And yet there's a separate story intertwined. Saul and Jonathan are becoming deeply connected to one another, and that will create another source of jealousy that Saul will have to David. And that's where we are now. We are right now, when we reach the end of verse 5, this is exactly where we are. We have sown the seeds of what will happen next. This terrible jealousy, the tragedy of the fall of Saul. This is what we are seeing now. Okay, it went over time a little bit, but that's because I started talking about Hamas. But open up and have any comments, questions? This is an opportunity. Anyone? Nobody?
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to
Lynn,
say
please.
that. Okay.
Well, Lynn, yes.
When David takes the 5 stones, that's always the subject of conversation. Why 5 stones? Any ideas? 5 pebbles in the sling?
Okay, 1 second, let me go back to that.
Verse 4.
I don't think there's any, no. First of all, I don't think is any significance, frankly. Takes 5 smooth stones from the nearby river.
Yeah.
I've heard discussion on that point before, that the Philistine had 5, it was him, and he had 4 brothers. So
Who had 4 brothers?
So Goliath. So
Then he hit Goliath and 4 brothers. It could be, but it's
so
not written.
that he was
It's possible.
prepared, so that he was prepared for in case the brothers came against him, but also that it showed that he had the faith that he had one for each brother because God was giving him the strength. So he knew he would get Goliath, that first one. But I've heard some of the people I talk with, they've done the research and found, was he Anakim? That going back through Goliath's family, he actually had 4 brothers.
I have no idea. It doesn't say, but I don't know.
Also, but I've actually heard it said that there's 5 major offerings, and that each pebble represented a major offering, and it was just the one pebble that was required, one offering.
I mean, the way I look at it, just at its level, I mean, because there's like the Midrash has different stories, and I didn't bring those in because to me, it's like, what can we learn from the text itself? That's the focus that I always have. And I just believe, he wasn't cocky. He was confident that God would help him, but he wasn't cocky. So he took 5 because he was going to say, well, if the first one doesn't work, I'm going to, quickly does the second one. And I think that shows that as much as he talked about, you'll see God is going to be with me and help defend, but that doesn't mean you have to, you just sit back. You've got to do your thing and then hope that God will bless you. You have to do the best you can.
Sondra,
yes.
If you follow David's life, you will notice that he was very much loved the number 5. Even when he went to the temple that Saul destroyed, he ended up with 5 loaves, and he had 5 people with him. It's like he was connected to the number.
Oh, that's very nice.
All of this
I didn't
history.
think of that. That's wonderful. Yeah. I'm going to look at that as I continue to study David. That is very nice. Let's take a look. We'll look at that. Debbie, you had a question.
Yeah, I did. First of all, thank you. Thank you so much for this teaching. This is wonderful. And our prayers are with you and your family for sure, for safety, pray to continue to be safe. And I love what she just said, what Claudette just said, because we know that God is in the numbers. So there's always the gematria, there's always some comparison with the numbers. Tell us, since you started out beginning talking about the spirit of Amalek and all of that, how that started way back when. Tell us, Sondra, how does Gath, where is Gath? Give us an idea of the geological location where that's at. And we can see the comparisons. As you were talking, I could see so many comparisons in what's going on here in this story that you're teaching and what's going on today with the spirit of Amalek. And it's no coincidence, I'm sure, that Israel has the David sling. Not only do you have the Iron Dome, but you also have what's called David's sling. So lead us into that, if you don't mind.
In other words,
not
when
at
they
all.
create weapons, they like to use biblical terms if they make sense. Yeah. But no, it's very interesting. For Amalek, again, there is no Amalek today physically. That nation is long gone. But Amalek has come to represent the ultimate evil. So put that at one side. Physically, where are we in Israel today? Gaza is where the Philistines were centered. So here we're in a battle with the Philistines. And that's when I said the Philistines came from the west, because we saw this throughout the book of Judges. The Philistines actually came from the sea. They were originating probably in the Greek islands, and they came in from the sea and settled along Israel's coastal plain, from Gaza in the south all the way up even north of where Tel Aviv is today. And in different periods of history, they get pushed further down or they have more up. Now, for example, if you remember the story of Samson, the Philistines come all the way to what was then the tribe of Dan, which is near Beit Shemesh of today. The place is called Sorah and Eshtaol. Okay, that is right at the Elah Valley. So the story of Samson shows Samson dealing with the Philistines who have come up against where he is. Okay, whereas in the valley just before the hills go up into the Judean mountains to the east. Okay, and Bethlehem is up there to the east. So if you figure the geography, David is coming from the Bethlehem going west down the mountain to the Elah Valley. Okay, just on the other side is where the Philistines have come from the west, and they've come that close in. So they're coming from Gaza and they're moving east from Gaza, and they're in that area. And it is David, by the way, once who becomes king, who will finally defeat the Philistines and get rid of most of them, and the few that remain are just like disparate peoples along the western coast. Gat is one of the Philistine cities that is today, for example, there's a city called Kiryat Gat. It's considered to be very close to biblical Gat. Where is that? It's between Gaza and Hebron. Between Gaza and Hebron, exactly. Okay, so it's just one of these Ekron, Gat, Gaza, Ashkelon, and I forgot the fifth one. There are 5 Philistine cities, and it's all in that area. From
Ashdod.
Ashdod, I don't know if Ashdod is one as well. Could be.
I thought so.
Could be. But Ashdod is north of Ashkelon. Ashkelon is just north of the Gaza Strip. So picture Israel today, just a bit north of the Gaza Strip, all the way down to the end of the Gaza Strip, and they've moved east, taking over so much of the coastal plain, moving towards the hills of Judea. That is where Philistines are hanging out, and this is the threat they present to Israel. Israel's strength has always been in the hills, always.
Sondra, can I ask you,
Yes, I think, Alison, you wanted to say something. Yes.
On the back of what you've just said with the geography, I keep hearing this word Jenin used. There's a refugee camp. Is that in that same area?
No, Jenin is in Samaria. Jenin is actually northeast from where I live.
Oh, okay.
That's a different area. Yeah. And in fact, that Jenin is thought to come from the word gan in Hebrew, garden. And it's actually in an area that was once considered a beautiful area of Samaria, very green, still is green, but what they've done with it is just awful. But
thank you.
Jenin and its refugee camp both is the what's it called? It is the it's in Samaria. It's one of the cities that Israel handed to the Palestinians as part of the Oslo Accords, and we've been suffering from that ever since.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, well, we've talked a lot. I will look forward to seeing you all again next week.